Pierre from France came over, and Jean Daniel of Didel. I picked him up at the airport, brought him to my house. They stayed over. I think I kicked Sam out into his brother's bedroom, and they were like in Sam's bedroom.
Chris out into mine.
Yeah, and Jean Daniel is also a robotics guy, and he had all kinds of interesting little toys and little like mice that would crawl around and find the edge of the table and stuff. And then so my kids had a blast with him. And then that was the year of the flood. I brought them over to like get flooded out. But I remember one thing in particular. This is hilarious. So I'm driving out here. You know, the next day I got my two friends from Europe with me, and one of them says to me, I think it was Jean-Marie, and he says, you Americans, how much time do you get off? How much vacation do you get a year? And I said, well, I work for a company and it's owned by a bank, and I'm kind of a senior guy, and I get like 5 weeks a year, but I never managed to use all 5 weeks. And he goes, a Frenchman would never allow that to happen. So we have this reputation of Americans of like working too much, and I think he thought that. So he came over. They came over that year, and then Jean-Marie came over, I think, two years later. I mean, it's just so much fun. Like, you pick your micro friends that you only correspond with via email up at the airport, bring them over, they stay in your house, you come out here, give some talks and so on. But those, even though it was a washout year, that was a great year. They were all great years. So I'm going to talk about carbon fiber molding planes, and some of you know that for quite a few years I was doing laser cut skeleton foam planes, and I had done a plane that had working flaps and skeletonized and slowed down, and I kept trying to think of what would I do next. I just couldn't come up with anything. Nothing would inspire me. I'd done so many skeleton planes, and then fairly shortly, I think I spotted it before Joe. Mine was on the way, and this guy from central Russia was making coaxial drives. Now, the F3P, these are the people that make the planes that just fly patterns. They were first using 2-cell, then 1-cell, and they have motor, prop combinations that were, they were running around 14 grams. I think they've got them a little lower, but they're for like big 35-inch planes. And this guy in Russia suddenly pops up, posts on RC groups, and very bad English, that he's got some little drives that weigh 3.8 grams with a brushless motor and 2 big counter-rotating props, and I immediately ordered one. And then I'm telling my wife, I've got a package coming from Russia, and you're going to have to sign for it. And she's like, we're now buying things from Russia? Like, don't worry, it's a modeler, he's very nice. And so, you'll have to look at it later at the indoor, but it's got 2 molded carbon fiber little wheels, like friction wheels, and then a little rubber drive on this tiny motor up here. And then these props, and I'll pass around some of this stuff. These props are, I don't know how he does them. I think they're shaped, molded something from Depron, and he skins them with insanely thin weight of fiberglass cloth. And these 2 props and the motor and the little brushless thing is 3.8 grams. So first, I was like, many years ago, I did a plane that was all laser cut, kind of a 3D plane that I called the Airbender, because my kids, one of their favorite TV shows was Avatar, The Last Airbender. And I went, this plane would bend air, so that would make sense. And so this guy, Ruslan, and I've got some cards I'll pass around if you want information on him. I was just going to like throw this on my old design. He's like, no, do carbon fiber. I said, I don't know how to do that. He goes, just try it. And so this is really his design plane. And I had pictures of it, but never from straight on, kind of an angle. So I would like draw it up in CAD, and I don't know how you overlap what carbon fiber rod where, so I would draw it up in different colors, and I would email it to him, and he would like draw a circle through it and go, "Nyet!" and I took that to mean don't do that, and so I sort of figured it out, and everybody just kept telling me, you've just got to dive in and do it. So essentially, what these F3P guys do, and they do much bigger planes than I'm doing, is anything that is a curve is molded. So a couple things. When I go to indoor flying in Massachusetts, the first thing people come up to me and they say, well, yeah, but can't you just take like some carbon fiber rod and a heat gun and just kind of heat it up and bend it? I'm like, yeah, this is epoxy, not plastic. You can. Yeah, you can do it. It just breaks. and so that's the first thing that they often ask. The second thing is, how do you glue the joints together? And they'll say, can't you get like some rubberized CA? Well, actually, Bob Smith has some, and it doesn't work for this at all. I've done a lot of testing on how to do it. So the essence of making one of these models is that there were some F3P guys in Russia who were really pioneering it, and they would use straight rod, and they would sand it thinner and bend it, and everything was under tension. And I'm convinced that all the advances in this came from places that are very far north and very cold with long winters, and it's primarily Finland and Russia. Okay, and I've traveled on business to Finland. It's pretty far north. And these guys had the epiphany of taking carbon fiber tow, mixing their two-part epoxy with it, and molding it into the curve. So now there's no tension. And so I mold a shape that comes up here, and there you get, the top shape. So anything that's curved, was molded, and they do the same thing for the wings. And then somebody sort of started to figure out that, well, maybe instead of like wrapping the joints with thin Kevlar and two-part epoxy, this guy in Seattle figured out that you can just use thick CA. We're overbuilding these things. So there's a lot of mistakes that you just kind of push through on the first model. If you come look at this, you would look and say, up close, and you'd say, well, that man does not know how to airbrush Mylar. So I'd never owned an airbrush. I bought an airbrush. I had an indoor fly session coming up, and I'm up at about 1 a.m. and I'm airbrushing this thing, and it's pretty blotchy. But all in, it weighs about 16 grams. It's 18-inch wingspan. Lee's son, Adam, was one of the first people to fly it. We made this thing at the indoor last year. And I'm standing next to him, and he's flying it, and this is the best description of this plane. He says, it's like flying in honey. and it's just literally that slow. So, molded this, and then Ray up here front decided he would do one. So he's got his version, which you'll see, but his is dyed kind of a grayish color. And our friend Chris decided to name it because it kind of looks like Star Wars, as he calls it the Darth Harlan plane. So there's actually, two of these, and they're not as bad as it seems. So I've got some little techniques. I'll kind of walk you through how you do it. It's really not that bad. You dive in. It sounds like it's daunting. It's not as bad as it seems. So that was the first one. And I actually have another one of these motors, or coaxial things. I said I'm not going to build the second version of the plane, which will have a full-on Citabria red, white, and blue with the stars on the end of the points scheme on that plane. So I'm not going to build that plane until two things happen. I'm better at this carbon fiber molding and construction, and my airbrush technique has improved. So the next plane that I did was this one. And it's a simple stick plane. And I wanted to see if I could do one that had a little bit of airfoil. So I molded the wings, and I also wanted to see if I could do more complicated shapes. And I thought, well, what would be more complicated than the little scallops at the back of a Fokker triplane wing? So if some people know me know that I do a lot of triplanes. So I've got this laying around in CAD, and I just pull it up and stretch it a little, and I said, I'm going to mold it. And I molded and did, two halves of the wing, and then I had to join them together, and I did a rib. So, the F3P guys, their planes are just, everything's flat because they want their planes to fly the same upside down as sideways, knife edge, all the same. So I did it pretty quick, but if you look at it from the side, you'll notice that out towards the wingtip, there's really not a lot of airfoil. So I'm getting an undercamber airfoil in the middle, and then here, and then it flattens to a tip. So I'm probably not getting as much lift. Now, this was kind of a little rabbit hole going down because I got thinking, I'd like to be able to loop this in my family room. And that may require a little bit more thrust. So then I was thinking, hey, when I was last doing 4mm pager motors, they didn't have little tiny quads. And so I start asking people. And so Bob, my friend Bob over there in the corner, he's like corresponding with me a little bit of 4mm motors. And Joe's got some, and I think you found it out maybe from Ross, who was doing a little direct drive. So next thing I know, I'm back into my testing thing, and I'm developing motor constants for little 4mm motors and figuring out what's the maximum power RPM. And I had these wonderful little ball bearing gearboxes that my friend Ralph Bradley had made for me. So when I finally got it, shipped them off to him because I do not know how he gets these little brass pinions on these shafts, and he retrofit them. And then this is one of the Russian guy's little props. I tried to get more. It's a little foam, and he goes, well, that was a one-off. I'm like, could you make me a couple more? No, I'm not going to do that. So, but this is a foam prop skinned in the fiberglass. So this plane weighs 6.6 grams, and I've got 10 grams of thrust, and I have pulled off a loop in my family room, which Sam will notice it's like a 2-story family room. So that was a success. And I had like little full pivoting, rudder back there because DR1s have that. So, but if you were to look at this up close, you'd say, this guy's, airbrushing techniques are still not quite there yet. So the next plane, which was just finished about not even quite a week ago, I wanted to do a couple things with it. I wanted to get even slower flying. So I thought, what plane has kind of nice squarish wingtips? Citabria, and I've done Citabria, so I have those laying around in CAD. And I wanted to get the airfoil all the way out to the wingtip. And I think I corresponded on an earlier one of my things with Matt. The rule of thumb for indoor planes was don't have more than a 4% camber. Anything more than 4% is just too much drag and you're wasting. And I emailed Matt and I said, it seems to me it's a trade-off. We've got more powerful motors and batteries, and if I'm willing to suffer that drag to get the lift, I think this is a trade-off I might want to make. So I've been gradually working my way up in terms of higher under camber. I think I may be at peak camber. This is 12% camber. One of my early ones, I called it the rule breaker, and it had little ailerons. It was skeletonized, and Lee's son Adam and I, when he was still in Boston, snuck into a gym in MIT in the middle of the summer. It was like August. There was nowhere to fly it. And it had little ailerons. And what we discovered, and he's an aerospace guy from MIT, was you get enough camber on the wings, the ailerons are in the shadow of that camber. And very bizarre things happen with trying to steer this plane with ailerons. And I concluded from that, having a lot of camber works, but probably should do it on a plane with dihedral and rudder elevator. And even now I have to have down elevator on this thing because of all the downwash I get off the back of it. So I'm thinking on this plane I may have achieved peak camber. This has 12% camber, triple the rule of thumb. But what I wanted was to get this camber all the way out to the wingtips. So how am I going to mold that in carbon fiber? And the way... where's my mold? There's a mold over here. I didn't bring it.
You're on the left.
Oh, it's the wing.
Oh, on the left, next to the boxes.
Keep going.
Here.
Oh, yeah, there it is. Okay, so I needed to mold the wing. So I wanted the dihedral move in, and I wanted the molded wingtip to have the curve. So I laser cut a mold, or form, out of plywood. And then this is, it's a little warped from all the rain here, but art paper. And it's 2 layers, and I've laser cut a little slot in the top piece so that it's roughly 0.5 millimeter wide. And I'll show you in a bit how I do this, but it's basically you wet out carbon fiber tow, and when it's just the right amount of cured, you lay it in this slot, and you lay it around and tape it as you go down, and you let it cure, and then you later bake it in an oven. And what you saw on that plane is just a perfect airfoil all the way out to the tip. Then I molded 2 more carbon fiber ribs, you glued those in, and 1 continuous piece overlapping at the front of the dihedral joint to get a little bit thicker there, and you get a wing. Now these are very flexible. I have a picture on the RC Groups thread where I twisted it. It looks like a double helix from DNA. I mean, these things have to be braced, but I've got a lot of under camber, goes all the way out, so that this green and white plane has that. If you look at it up close, I think you would look at this and finally say that man is beginning to learn how to airbrush. So the other experiment on this, these are done with clear 2UM Mylar, and what I did was I used painting stencils, and the F3P guys, they cover their planes because everything's flat, and they just put them down with the carbon fiber and they lay their stuff down, they airbrush them. And I thought, I ought to be able to airbrush one side of the Mylar, then carefully pull it up, tape it down the other, and have my jigs and stuff, and paint the other side. So this was my experiment in painting one color on one side of the Mylar, and then flip it over and do the other, and then the painting masks, which have a little bit of 3M77 dusted on, aren't trying to pull off the paint that you've just applied. And the colors on this just pop. So where am I going with this? So one of the things was, the F3P or the 3D plane, very fun, I love that plane. But I'm probably heading towards a full carbon fiber built up fuselage. But you don't want to start with that. So I thought, I'm going to see, can I do under camber wings? Well, I think I can do that now. Can I do kind of more realistic, scale-ish tail surface? I can do that. So I've got those. The next step is going to be to try to see if I can do a fuselage. So it's a process, and I can probably do the other plane now because I think my airbrushing skills are beginning to get there. So how do we do this? And we're going to keep this on schedule, but it's not as bad as it seems. And I've got a thing over here. We'll pass around stuff. It's always good if you can kind of see things. So it sounds very daunting to mold carbon fiber rod, and it's really not. So here's what it entails, and these I'll put in a little box and pass it around. So carbon fiber tow is just a bunch of strands of carbon fiber, and they come in different counts. This is 3K carbon fiber, and it's the fairly typical. This is the same carbon fiber. If you buy off the shelf woven cloth, that's going to be this. As I've gone further down this rabbit hole, I've found out that there's like very high modulus ones, and Ray and I found out that the best way to get the really high modulus carbon fiber tow is if your name is Boeing. And if you're not Boeing, you're not going to get it. But there is a guy that we managed to get some from, and don't spread this too far. I asked him, how the heck did you get this Torre, this little number? He goes, I befriended a shipping clerk at the company, and he's manages to get it, and so I've got some of it. And by the way, Ross is out there somewhere. I brought Ross here. Let me hand it back to you. Ross, there's your very elusive Torre carbon fiber tow. Okay, so turns out also that 3K tow from one is the strands are thinner. So 3K of that stuff is not like 3K of this stuff. So this is 3,000 strands, and you get it on a roll. And the way I've done it, I've not invented this stuff. I've just borrowed from very helpful people who are willing to share what they learn. And so I have a piece of plywood on a table in the middle of my workshop, and it's about 3.5 feet long, and that's pretty much how long I mold carbon fiber rods. So you take the carbon fiber tow, you stretch it out, and at one end you hit it with some CA so it hardens. And then I put gaffer's tape. Gaffer's seems to work better than duct tape. And then you do the other end, and what you end up with, but it's about 3 feet long, is something that looks like this. Okay? And then you tape it down, and it's on wax paper. And previously, because it's good to get it going, you've mixed up, just in a cup, some epoxy. And you have 2 little syringes, and I'm just using ordinary West epoxy like they build boats with. And I've got the 105 epoxy, and I think I got the 205 hardener because it works a little faster. And you do it with weight, and I do it, it's 5. So you pull up 5, whatever you pull up, and you put it in your cup and weigh it, you do it, and then you put it back in its own Ziploc bag. The 2 syringes should never touch, never should they meet, or they will contaminate all of your stuff. Okay, so you do that, and it's like literally 5 grams. To do one string, they're about 5 grams. And then, if you've ever seen any cooking shows, my daughter's very into baking, and they have these things that they fill with frosting, and then you squeeze the bag and you frost it. So you take it and you pour it out, and you take a Ziploc and you cut a little tiny corner off. And then you've got this thing here, and you just go along each scope. It's like a little baker, and you just drizzle epoxy along there, and then the thing's taped out, and you just run your finger along and work it in. And then in my workshop, I've just got some finishing nails up in a beam. These have a hole I put there, and you hang it up there, and then one of those little woodworking spring-loaded clamps. Again, I got this from this guy George, in the idea from him in Michigan. You clamp it on the lower one, and then you run a piece of tape from there over. I have a little step ladder to do it so that the thing doesn't twist around. So you've got one of these, 2 of them, 3, depends on how much you're molding. You hang them up, and you just take some paper towels, cut off some little pieces, fold them over, and you start squeegeeing the excess epoxy. Excess epoxy is just weight. It's not giving you strength. And you do that. Okay, then it's hanging up there, and then you do the next one. You squeeze and you squeeze it again, and then you take your palms. And this is this guy George who did it. And people are like, ooh, you're touching epoxy. It's not bad. You just have ammonia and just take it off. And you palm it between these. And Ray, you kind of figured this out.
You just use cheap Harbor Freight
Just do it on your and you palm it, and that's getting more out, and it's starting to round it. Then you let it cure some more, and then George has this technique where he uses sanding pads that you get from the hardware store, and you put wet and dry paper on it backwards, so the cardboard side is flat, and you paddle it. So it's now kind of getting it rounded, and I'll let people look later. You can look at my straight rods, and they feel like fairly close to pull-truded. So I made some of these long ones, and I got to take 3 of them, and I'd weigh them, and then I would weigh them compared to commercial ones, and mine were spot on with theirs. So I very quickly said there's no point in me making my own straight carbon fiber rods. If I can't make it lighter, I'm not making it. So where do I get my carbon fiber rods? I get them from the composite store in California, and Rick, you'll appreciate this. They get them from the Dutch company, DPP, who makes, I think, the finest carbon fiber rods. Where else are you going to get 0.7 millimeter OD tubes, which is what I'm using for the landing gear on those 2 little stick planes. So wonderful stuff. I've got carbon fiber rods that came from like China, and they're like soft and spun. No, get the good stuff. But the curved stuff is made from unobtainium, because you're not getting the curved molded carbon fiber rods unless you mold it yourself. So you've got this rod up here, sanded and paddle it, and at around the 1 hour point, it's starting to get not sticky anymore, and you can kind of tell by touching they're hanging. So then what do you do to mold it? And there's a couple of ways to do it. The big 3D plane in there was all molded in grooves in Depron. I got this idea from the guy in Russia. And it's literally this easy. You start with a template. You can cut it out by hand. Obviously, if you have a laser, you laser cut everything. And a kind of pointed wooden tool. And you put it down in Depron, and you just trace around. I'll pass this around in a second. And you've got a groove. And you take your wetted out toe, and you lay it into that groove, and then you have little thin strips of masking tape, and you tape one across, tape one, and you just work it around, and you put it in there. You can get surprisingly good. There's some guys in Russia that make a plane, and what they do is they take a big piece of MDF, and they use a big CNC mill with a very tiny bit, and they route little square grooves in it. Now Ray, when he did his, because he has a CNC mill, he milled his own, and I was thinking, well, how am I going to get a square-edged hole or notch that I can mold in? Well, I don't have a CNC mill, but I got a laser. And I thought, well, if I laser cut all the way through 2 cuts, do some experimentation until I get 0.5 millimeter in the top piece of the paper, this is art paper, and glue it on top of another, that will give me a nice little square channel. So this is the molds for the second, the little Citabria, the tail. And you just take this, and the goal is you put the thing in, and you're not pulling it or stretching it, and you just kind of lay it in there, and it's still nice and flexible. Get it in, put the little pieces of tape, and then you let it sit overnight. Then you wait till your wife is not home, and you put this between 2 sheets of glass, and you take it up to her oven, and you bake it for about another 2 to 3 hours at about 150 degrees, and you get wonderfully nice, hard pieces of carbon fiber. So I'm going to pass a few of these around. I'm just going to put them in here. You can look at the epoxy. Those are the pieces. And then I'll start talking about, pass around next. What do you form it with? And I've got a few molded pieces that I'll throw in here. Like this was a reject wing with a little scalloping. It's always good if you can touch things. Oh, and then sometimes you have like a little bit of carbon fiber left over, and you go, what the hell? It's like, so I grabbed an aluminum rod and I just wrapped it around. I got like a carbon fiber spring. That's kind of a fun thing. Maybe you could make like a little landing gear on a Ford tri-motor or something with this. So I'll throw that in there. This is the little template. Let's see, is there anything else? Oh, I got some props from Ruslan, the guy in Russia, recently, and he threw in a couple of extra for me, but he'd already made the little box. So he chopped off the ends. I know. Okay, so don't worry. But anyway, you can like manhandle this one. I mean, you look at this, and it's just insane. This is a little all carbon fiber prop that he makes. He seems to be one of the few people doing it. And then, if anybody, he's got it. There's no prices on there yet, but he's got a fairly rudimentary website that literally just went up in the last week or so. These are little laser engraved things. It's got his email and his website, and then a little CAD drawing of his engraved in there. Of it's like, send me something and I'll laser engrave it for you. So those are in there. If anybody wants to know how to contact, he's a wonderful guy. I mean, Joe and I. Let me see. Joe, you've bought from him. I've bought from him, and wonderful guy, right? Oh, and then you have 5 people. I mean, it's like, do not worry about ordering from somebody in Russia. It doesn't matter where modelers are; they're good. So let me start up here. Just kind of pass this stuff around.
He does like to do the French thing.
Yeah.
Gordon, do you have any trouble with the pieces sticking to your molds, or have you pulled out so much epoxy it's not?
Yeah, you wait till it's kind of dryish. It's starting to get less tacky, and so this is really not a problem. In the grooved method, if you want, you can put a little wax or MDF. I did it at first, and I realized it wasn't sticking. The ones where I'm doing it in the little carbon fiber slot, you just lay it in, just drive it, it doesn't stick.
Do you put glass or something on top to flatten it as it cures? Or you
No, it just kind of stays there. Well, oh yeah. So just to be sure, I generally do when I'm all done. I just put a sheet of glass on it and leave it overnight, and it cures. So then, how do you assemble this stuff? So I'll pass these around. So there's a few methods for assembling it. Some people draw out their plans on a sheet of paper, lay a big piece of plastic down, and then they lay their curved, molded pieces in place, tape them down, and then you get the straight lengths and you fit them in, and then you hit it. Some people do it with where they do it with epoxy. I'm a big believer in just doing it with CA. Other people draw on a piece of Depron, and then they take a sharpened brass tube and cut holes out. And again, I'm like, I got a laser, I can cut those holes. Hey, I bet I can probably score little lines that are just the right width and depth for 0.5 millimeter carbon fiber rod to fit in there. Turns out you can do that, and that's really neat because then you put your piece and it just drops down into its little slot. So what you do is you take a curved piece, I'll pass these around, of the elevator, and then a straight length of commercial DPP, and you start with one corner. You get them where they just butt up against each other, and I've got like a piece of wax paper with, and I use Bob Smith Ultra Maxi Pure, I think, the super thick, and you just daub over there, you daub over here. Then I breathe on it, and then I hit it with the accelerator. I've done tests, and you actually get a slightly stronger joint hitting it with the CA, which is good because I'm always in a hurry.
What's the breathing on it do?
The moisture. Somebody told me the moisture just by breathing on it, it will start the process. So if the stuff is really too super liquid, you hit it with the CA, and as you pull it off, you'll get like a little point coming up. So I want it to be slightly cured, and then I hit it with the CA. Now it's not going anywhere. And you know, it's one of these things where everybody was overbuilding by wrapping them and doing this stuff, and it's like you don't need to. And by the way, the rubberized stuff from Bob Smith, who makes one of just for this purpose, it will not work. Don't waste your money. Both Joe and I found it. It just doesn't work. So then what you do is you just start taking the little straight pieces and you nip them to length, and then you got a little sanding block and just sand do it, you know, and it takes some time. When you get it where it's just perfect, tape it down, hit those, and it's, you know, it's good to be having some music playing or something in the background because this will take you a while. And you just basically build up these pieces out of molded carbon fiber rod, and it's a combination of stuff you've molded and straight stuff, and you're just hitting every joint with CA, and it's a wonderfully addictive way of building a plane.
Is it zen and therapeutic?
What?
Is it zen and therapeutic?
Yeah, I don't know. You know, it's like, but it's the whole process. You have to think so far ahead, and like, oh, I'm going to mold it, then I'm going to bake it in the oven, and you know, and then when it all comes together, and you're like airbrushing it, but it's pretty light, and and when you show up at indoor flying, nobody has a plane like this. I mean, there's a crowd around you. They're like, what the hell are you doing?
Like my 8th one of these lectures.
I was once baking the carbon in the oven, and wanted to hit 10 minutes extra, but hit the microwave button. My wife was also in the kitchen. I'm still allowed to do it.
You actually actually baked it with her there. See, I wait till she's gone. She's like, I'm going to run some errands. I'm like, I come up and put my stuff in the oven.
Only when I melt that.
So Gordon, are you going to say anything about the heat shrink tube method?
Oh, yeah. So the process of doing this, when they started trying to mold the carbon fiber rod, the Finnish guys first figured out, hey, maybe we can wet out carbon fiber tow and pull it through very thin tubing. Problem is, you can actually calculate how much force it takes to pull something through a tubing, and the longer the tubing, the more friction, and it becomes almost impossible to pull through. So then somebody else figured out, oh, you can get heat shrink tubing. And what you do now, you just wet it all out, you get the excess off, and then you CA very thin piano wire to one end of your toe, and you slide a piece of heat shrink tubing up over it. So I have now a large collection of heat shrink tubing. And I'm convinced for us as sort of ordinary modelers, it doesn't matter. The idea with the heat shrink tubing is that you get like a nice round rod. But if you bend it and it's a little bit too hard, it's going to start flattening out. But here's the problem. I believe that the Russians are not using ordinary epoxy like I'm using. I think that they're very secretive about it. I believe that they're using a very low temp, or that isn't influenced by the heat, as much epoxy. So when I've done this, what happens is, as I'm shrinking the tubing, the heat shrink tubing, by the time I get the heat shrink tubing shrunk nice and tight, the epoxy inside is kicking and it's stiff. And so I've come to the conclusion, for my purposes, I can get good enough carbon fiber rod and lay it in there. And oh, by the way, you know how you get the heat shrink tubing off? You lay it all down, you take a very brand new hobby knife and you slice along the top, slice off, and then you peel it off. And if you miss just a little bit, this is 0.5 millimeter, you cut right through your carbon fiber rod and the piece is ruined. That one piece, the wing that's in there, that's what happened, is like it sliced off the end, and it's one more thing that can go wrong. And so this guy George is doing it without the heat shrink tubing. This guy in Michigan, the Russian guy Ruslan, who I passed around his cards, he's doing it without, and I'm just convinced that you can just dispense with that, and it's one less thing that you need to worry about to do it. So you can do it. Ray, you didn't do the heat shrink. You did it this way too. Yeah. So it's one of these things where somebody gets a technique, and then other people kind of start boiling it down to the bare minimum. What's the least I can do? And it feels to me like that's what's kind of happened with this. We've gotten down. You're like, hey, this is good enough. I'm building a little parasol plane, right? It's not a bridge. And I'm going to have to brace it externally and all, and it'll work. Any other questions? I think, Steve, that I'd forgotten that whole part about the heat shrink tubing. All right, then I'm done. And Matt and